May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The clock on the wall of Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters struck 0800 hours. The morning light filtered through the open windows, cutting through the smoke of naval operations and the tension that hung heavy in the room. Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, intelligence officer to the commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood silently before Nimitz. In his hand was a folder, plain, gray, unremarkable, but the information within it was anything but ordinary. "The Japanese are coming to Midway," Layton announced. "They'll approach from the northwest, bearing 3 to 5 degrees. They'll be sighted at approximately 175 miles from the island. The attack will begin at 0700 hours on June 4th. Nimitz looked at him, his calm expression betraying neither disbelief nor surprise, only calculation. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you know exactly where Yamamoto will be when he'll arrive, and what he intends to do?" Layton nodded once. "That's correct, sir. We can read every order, every position report, every communication between Japanese commanders. We know their entire battle plan." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, with the steady composure that defined his leadership, Nimitz replied, "Very well." He understood what this meant. The United States Navy possessed a weapon unlike any other weapon of pure intellect. America could read Japan's secrets. What no one in that room fully appreciated was that this moment, this calm, almost clinical exchange was the culmination of 2 decades of unseen struggle. A hidden war fought not with guns and ships, but with pencils, paper, and an unrelenting belief that information could win battles. To understand how the Navy had come to this point, how it had learned to read the thoughts of its enemy, one must go back to the 1920s, when a handful of visionaries began to see the next war not as a contest of armies, but of minds. The visionary, Lawrence Safford, and the birth of Navy cryptology in 1924. A young naval officer named Lawrence F. Safford began making quiet changes within the bureaucracy of the U.S. Navy, a meticulous man with a scholar's patience. Safford understood something that few of his peers did. The next war would not be won solely at sea or in the air, it would be won through information. At the time, cryptology was an obscure art practiced by a few hobbyists and diplomats. The Navy's intelligence work consisted mostly of clerks trying to interpret radio chatter and decode basic ciphers. Yet Safford saw potential in this neglected field. He convinced his superiors to let him create the Navy's first organized code and signal section. A modest office staffed by a handful of officers armed with little more than pencils, notebooks, and an obsession with patterns. Safford's genius lay not only in technical insight but in foresight. He recognized that the Pacific, not Europe, would be the decisive theater of the future and that Japan, a rising imperial power, would eventually challenge America's interests. So he began to build the Navy's first real cryptologic capability from scratch. He recruited men with uncommon talents, linguists who had lived in Japan, mathematicians with an instinct for patterns, and radio operators who could pull faint signals out of the static of the Pacific ether. These were not typical sailors. They were thinkers, problem solvers, eccentric minds who saw numbers and words as puzzles to be mastered. By the early 1930s, Safford's efforts had grown into a small but formidable network. The Navy established a series of intercept stations across the Pacific, one at Pearl Harbor, another at Cavite in the Philippines, and a third in Washington, D.C. From these quiet outposts, American radio operators began listening to Japanese transmissions day and night, building a library of encrypted traffic that would later become the foundation for the greatest code-breaking triumph in naval history. Among the men Safford drew into his orbit was a young officer, whose name would one day become synonymous with the art of naval cryptanalysis: Joseph John Rochefort, the apprentice. Joseph Rochefort's journey into shadows. Joseph Rochefort joined the Navy in 1918, a wiry 17-year-old who had lied about his age to enlist during the final months of the First World War. He was no ordinary sailor. From the start, his superiors noticed his gift for language and logic, for seeing the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated details. While most of his contemporaries sought the excitement of sea duty, Rochefort was assigned to the Navy's Code and Signal Section in Washington, D.C., where he was introduced to the strange, secret world of cryptography. He took to it instinctively. In 1929, the Navy sent him to Tokyo for what would become one of the most formative experiences of his life. There, in the heart of Japan, Rochefort studied the language, the culture, and perhaps most importantly, the mindset of the Japanese military elite. He immersed himself completely, not just in grammar and vocabulary, but in the rhythms of thought and the nuances of communication that would one day help him anticipate an enemy's moves. During this time, he met another young officer who shared his fascination with Japan and his belief that the key to victory lay in understanding the enemy's mind. That man was Edwin T. Layton. The two became close friends, bound by a shared conviction that linguistic and cultural knowledge would be indispensable in any future conflict. Together, they became part of a quiet cadre of naval officers preparing for a war that most Americans did not yet believe would come. The unbreakable code, JN-25. The Japanese Navy had always been secretive, but in 1939, they introduced a new system that would challenge even the best cryptanalytic minds in the world. On June 1, 1939, Japan deployed its most sophisticated naval code yet designated by American cryptanalysts as JN-25. JN stood simply for Japanese Navy, and 25 indicated it was the 25th code system the Americans had catalogued. But this was no ordinary cipher. It was an enciphered code, a complex two-step system that combined linguistic substitution with mathematical encryption. First, Japanese operators used a codebook containing approximately 33,000 entries. Each word or phrase, aircraft carrier, fuel, rendezvous, attack, and so on was represented by a 5-digit number, but these numbers weren't transmitted directly. Before being sent, they were altered using a second set of numbers from a different book, called additive tables. The operator would add one 5-digit group to another, creating a new 5-digit sequence that bore no obvious connection to the original. To decrypt a message, one first had to remove the additive, then match the resulting code group to the right word in the codebook. It was, effectively, two ciphers layered atop one another, a nightmare for anyone trying to read it without the books. By late 1940, American and British cryptanalysts working together had managed to make limited progress. They had identified perhaps 10% of the code, groups about 3,800 out of 33,000, but the work was painfully slow. There were too few analysts, too few intercepts, and too many unknowns. Then, just as progress began to show promise, the Japanese changed everything. On December 1, 1940, they replaced their entire codebook, creating a new version dubbed JN-25B. Every meaning changed. Every known pattern became useless overnight. The Americans had to start over. The shadow of Pearl Harbor by late 1941. After nearly 2 years of painstaking effort, American codebreakers had recovered roughly 1,500 code groups of the new JN-25B system. There was optimism that within a few months they might begin reading live traffic again. But the Japanese struck first. On December 4, 1941, 3 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese changed their additive tables, introducing a new variation called Additive 8. It wasn't a complete overhaul like the codebook change the year before, but it was enough to blind the cryptanalysts temporarily. They would need weeks to recover the new additives. Then came December 7, 1941, the day of infamy, when Japanese aircraft roared out of the clouds over Oahu, dropping torpedoes and bombs on the anchored U.S. Pacific Fleet. The men of the Navy's cryptologic units felt the shock as a personal failure. They had been studying JN-25 for years. If they had broken it sooner, perhaps there might have been some warning, some clue in the traffic they were intercepting. Among those who took it hardest was Joseph Rochefort, who by then had been assigned to command the Navy's Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor, the nerve center of Pacific cryptology. When he took charge in mid-1941, it was an unassuming operation in the basement of the 14th Naval District's administrative building near the submarine base. But after Pearl Harbor, that basement became the beating heart of America's secret war. Station HYPO, the basement war room from the outside, the building that housed Station HYPO, looked like nothing more than a concrete administrative office. Inside, down a narrow stairwell guarded by Marines, lay a world few outsiders ever saw. The main room was about 60 feet long, windowless, and illuminated by humming fluorescent lights that made the air seem perpetually gray. The temperature swung wildly stifling hot during the day, despite the air conditioning, freezing cold at night when the machines ran full tilt. The smell of cigarette smoke, coffee, and machine oil hung constantly in the air. This was the front line of the intelligence war. Rochefort ran it with eccentric intensity. He worked 72-hour stretches without rest, wore a smoking jacket and slippers, because the basement was too cold at night, and often forgot to shave for days. He chain-smoked, drank coffee by the gallon, and demanded of his men the same relentless focus he demanded of himself. But behind his eccentricity lay brilliance and a profound sense of mission. He knew that the work they were doing could change the course of the war. He surrounded himself with a team of equally talented misfits. Thomas Dyer, a mathematical genius who devised ways to use IBM punch-card machines to analyze intercepted messages. Alva La, a linguist fluent in Japanese, who understood the subtle nuances of military phrasing. Joseph Finnegan, a mathematician whose work on daytime groups would later prove pivotal in breaking JN25B. Ham Wright, another cryptanalyst, whose patience and precision made him invaluable. And then there were the enlisted men, many of them musicians from the USS California, which had been sunk during the Pearl Harbor attack. With their ship destroyed, they were reassigned to Station HYPO. Rochefort believed that musicians, with their training in rhythm and pattern, were naturally suited to code-breaking. As it turned out, he was right. The work of numbers and noise, the task before them was monumental. Every intercepted Japanese message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups, sometimes 200 per message. SOMETIMES 500. Each had to be stripped of its additive, decoded, and then matched to a growing catalogue of known meanings. At the start of 1942, they could read perhaps a few hundred code groups, barely enough to grasp fragments of meaning. Yet even fragments could be powerful. A ship name here, a location there, a phrase that hinted at timing or intent. Piece by piece, these scraps of information began to reveal patterns. The analysts also used traffic analysis, studying who was sending messages to whom, and when to infer what they couldn't yet read. When radio traffic increased between certain commands, it often signaled preparations for an operation. When a ship's call sign suddenly went silent, it meant the vessel had gone to radio silence, usually because it was at sea, moving toward a target. Meanwhile, the clatter of IBM tabulating machines filled the room like the heartbeat of the operation. These hulking electromechanical devices, originally designed for corporate accounting, became the codebreakers' most powerful tools. Each intercepted message was transcribed onto punch cards. The machines could then sort and count the data at speeds no human could match, revealing patterns in the numbers that helped identify recurring additives or code structures. Still, the machines could only process data. Interpretation required the human mind, intuition, logic, and experience. Through the winter and spring of 1942, Rochefort's team lived in that basement, chasing patterns through the endless streams of numbers, often sleeping on cots beside the machines. When they did manage to sleep, they dreamed in 5-digit sequences. By April 1942, they had achieved something astonishing. They could read about 20% of all JN25B messages. It wasn't total mastery, but it was enough to understand the enemy's intentions. The first signs of a new threat. By late April, HYPO's analysts began to notice a recurring code group appearing in messages of. It was clearly a geographic designator. But what did it mean? Messages about AF mentioned preparations, troop movements, and the concentration of carriers and supply ships. The Japanese were clearly planning a major operation, scheduled for early June. But where was A? Logic suggested it was somewhere in the Central Pacific, perhaps one of the islands near Hawaii. Some thought it referred to Johnston Atoll, others to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. Rochefort and Layton, however, were convinced that AF was Midway, the small but strategic atoll, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan. If they were right, then Japan was preparing to strike Midway and perhaps use it as a staging ground for an assault on Hawaii itself. But they needed proof. The stage is set. The tension in the Pacific mounted in May 1942. The analysts of Station HYPO worked around the clock to confirm their theory. Every intercept mattered. Every additive stripped away brought them closer to certainty. Outside the basement walls, the war raged across the Pacific. Japan had seized territory from Burma to the Solomons. The Allies were reeling, their fleets scattered, their morale battered. Yet in that small, windowless room beneath Pearl Harbor, the tide was about to turn. The men there did not carry rifles or fly planes. They wielded logic, language, and relentless will, and through sheer intellect and endurance, They were about to deliver Admiral Nimitz the most valuable gift any commander could receive in wartime: knowledge of the enemy's plan before the first shot was fired. A code and a question. By early May 1942, in the windowless basement of the 14th Naval District building at Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO was alive with restless energy. The clatter of IBM punch-card machines never ceased. The air hummed with fatigue and the quiet intensity of men who knew they were running out of time. Each day, dozens of new Japanese naval messages were intercepted, copied, and converted into endless columns of 5-digit groups. The pattern was unmistakable. Message after message mentioned a place designated only as AF. It appeared in discussions of aircraft assignments, supply convoys, and fleet movements. Commanders were directed to prepare fuel. Reserves for operations near AF. Air units were ordered to reconnoiter AF. Every new intercept made it clearer that Japan was preparing a major offensive, but no one could yet say where. Inside HYPO, two theories divided the analysts. Washington's codebreaker, led by the Redmond brothers, believed AF referred to a location in the North Pacific, possibly the Aleutian Islands or Alaska. Others suggested it might be Fiji or Samoa, deep in the South Pacific. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, favored the Aleutians theory. He was skeptical of Rochefort's sometimes unorthodox conclusions, but Joseph Rochefort was certain AF meant Midway Atoll. His reasoning was both analytical and intuitive. Japanese message traffic often used letter designations that began with A for areas in or near the Hawaiian chain. The frequency and type of units mentioned in connection with AF pointed to a location of immense strategic importance. Midway fit perfectly. It was the outermost American outpost guarding the Hawaiian Islands. Still, belief wasn't proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz could not risk his remaining carriers on a hunch. After 6 months of Japanese victories across the Pacific, America's carrier force was its last line of defense. If Rochefort was wrong, if AF was not Midway, and Nimitz positioned his ships incorrectly, the Pacific Fleet could be annihilated. The men of HYPO needed to be certain. A brilliant ruse. The solution came from an unexpected source, a man named Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, a quiet, creative officer serving under Rochefort. Holmes had once written pulp adventure stories under the pen name Alec Hudson, but his imagination now served a far greater cause. If IF is Midway, Holmes suggested, let's make the Japanese tell us so. The plan was simple but ingenious. Midway would send a false radio message, unencrypted and easily intercepted, reporting a specific problem, something believable enough that Japanese intelligence might include it in their own communications. If a Japanese message later referred to that problem at AF, the matter would be settled. Holmes proposed a mechanical failure that could affect base operations but wouldn't compromise security. The story: Midway's water distillation plant had broken down, and the island urgently needed fresh water supplies. Admiral Nimitz, briefed by Layton, immediately approved the deception. On May 19, 1942, an undersea cable message secure from Japanese interception was sent from Pearl Harbor to the Midway garrison with instructions to broadcast the false report in plain language. The next morning, the radio message went out from Midway to Commander, Pacific Fleet, water distillation plant out of commission. Need fresh water urgently. Then, the waiting began. Confirmation in the cramped, smoky basement of Station HYPO. Analysts hunched over intercept receivers and teletypes. For 2 days, they scanned every incoming signal from Japanese sources. Dozens of messages arrived, most unreadable, but they searched for one clue, one reference to the deception. Then, on May 22, 1942, the moment came. A Japanese intelligence summary, transmitted from Tokyo to several fleet commands, was intercepted and partially Among its lines was a simple report: AF is short of water. Additional supplies to be prepared for the operation. The room erupted in subdued jubilation. The ruse had worked. The Japanese had taken the bait-hand in confirming Midway's water shortage. They had also confirmed that AF was Midway. There was no longer any doubt. The next major Japanese offensive would target the tiny atoll that bore that name. Rochefort sent the confirmation to Layton, who carried it directly to Nimitz. When the Admiral read the message, his reaction was calm but decisive. "Good," he said. "Now we know where to find them." The race against time, knowing the target, was only the first step. The Japanese Navy was the most powerful naval force in the world. commanded by the brilliant and audacious Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. Yamamoto's plan for the upcoming battle was as ambitious as it was complex. His objective was to lure out and destroy the remaining American carriers, the one force that still threatened Japanese dominance. To do this, he planned a massive feint, and a northern diversionary force would attack the Aleutians to draw American attention northward, while his main strike force, 4 of Japan's best carriers, would attack Midway from the northwest. Once the island's defenses were crushed, an invasion force would occupy it. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships would lie in wait to ambush any American carriers that responded. It was an intricate plan, coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean. If successful, it would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet permanently, but the entire plan depended on surprise, and Japan's secret weapon, JN-25, was no longer secret. In the final week of May, Rochefort's team worked around the clock to refine their understanding of the operation. The clatter of IBM punch-card machines filled the basement as analysts combed through every intercept. Joseph Finnegan, a soft mathematician, focused on deciphering the date-time groups, the encrypted portions of messages that specified the timing of operations. For weeks, the Japanese had masked their dates and times with extra layers of additive encipherment. Finnegan methodically tested patterns, checking for numerical correlations across messages. He called his method the 12 by 31 garble check, referencing the 12 months and 31 days through which he tested permutations. Then, on May 25, he found it. By cross-referencing multiple message fragments, Finnegan cracked the datetime system. For the first time, the Americans could read not only what the Japanese were planning, but also when they intended to act. Working feverishly, HYPO analysts applied the breakthrough to recent intercepts. Piece by piece, the full Japanese order of battle emerged. For fleet carriers, Akabagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu would form the main strike force. They would be supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and an invasion convoy carrying troops to occupy Midway. The strike was scheduled to begin at 0700 hours on June 4, 1942. The carriers would approach from the northwest, launching aircraft at a distance of roughly 175 miles from the island. It was a level of intelligence precision almost unheard of in warfare. Layton's briefing on May 27, 1942. The damaged carrier USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor following the Battle of the Coral Sea. Her decks were torn, her structure battered, but she was still afloat. Nimitz ordered her into dry dock and gave the shipyard a near impossible task: complete 3 months of repairs in 3 days. That same morning, as workers swarmed over Yorktown's hull, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton entered Admiral Nimitz's office carrying Rochefort's latest intelligence summary. It was a quiet moment. The headquarters was busy but subdued. Everyone understood that something immense was unfolding. Layton opened his folder and began to brief. "The enemy will attack Midway," he said. "They will approach from the northwest, on bearing 3 to 5 degrees. They'll be sighted at about 175 miles from the island. The attack will begin around 0700 hours on June 4th. He paused, then added, 4 carriers, Tsukagi Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by a powerful escort. A secondary force will strike the Aleutians simultaneously." Nimitz listened without interruption. He was a man who preferred facts to theatrics, but the precision of this report bordered on the unbelievable. "You're confident of this?" he asked. Layton met his gaze. "Completely confident. We're not guessing, sir. We're reading their orders." For a long moment, Nimitz said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well." With that decision, the fate of the Pacific War began to shift. A navy at the brink to execute his plan. Nimitz needed every available carrier, but there were only 3 operational: Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown. The Japanese would bring forward with superior aircraft and pilots. They would still have the advantage in numbers, range, and experience. Nevertheless, Nimitz was determined. He trusted his intelligence team completely. In a later account, Layton recalled that Nimitz's composure that morning never wavered. He listened quietly, Layton wrote, and when the briefing was done, he smiled faintly and said, "We'll be there waiting for them." Meanwhile, in the shipyard, more than 1,400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard labored around the clock to repair Yorktown. Welding torches threw blue sparks across the night sky as teams patched holes, replaced flight deck plating, and rigged temporary repairs. Power demands were so great that the Navy ordered rolling blackouts across Oahu to keep electricity flowing to the shipyard. Against all odds, in just 72 hours, the Yorktown was ready. Her engines were functional, her decks patched, her air group replenished. On May 30th, she steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join Admiral Raymond Spruance's and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task forces assembling northeast of Midway. Setting the trap. Nimitz's plan was bold and simple. Use the intelligence from HYPO to ambush the Japanese fleet. Knowing the direction and timing of their approach, he positioned his carriers far to the northeast of Midway, exactly where Yamamoto least expected them. The Japanese assumed the American carriers would still be based at Pearl Harbor, nearly 1,000 miles away. They expected to destroy the Midway garrison first, then lure any surviving U.S. ships into battle under unfavorable conditions. Instead, the Americans would be lying in wait. As May turned to June, the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most remarkable strategic duels in naval history. Both sides believed they would achieve surprise. Only one was right. On June 3rd, American patrol planes spotted elements of the Japanese invasion force to the west. The following day, radar operators on Midway detected incoming aircraft exactly as Layton had predicted. At 07:02 hours, on June 4, 1942, Japanese bombers began their assault on Midway Island. Nimitz's first thought, upon receiving confirmation of the attack, was to turn to Layton and remark, "Your timing was off by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles." The accuracy was astounding, and the battle had only just begun. The unseen victory, even as bombs rained down on Midway. American carriers were already in position. When Japanese reconnaissance finally spotted them, it was too late. In a matter of hours, dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown found and struck 3 of the Japanese carriers, Kagai, Kaga, and Soryu, while their decks were loaded with refueling aircraft and armed bombs. All 3 were set ablaze within minutes. By the end of the day, the 4th carrier, Hiru, was also destroyed. In exchange, the Americans lost Yorktown, badly damaged by a counterattack, and the destroyer, USS Hamon, which was torpedoed while assisting her. But the strategic outcome was unquestionable. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were gone. Japan lost over 290 aircraft and more than 3,500 men, including many of its most experienced pilots and deck crews. The United States lost 145 aircraft and 307 men, but the deeper loss for Japan was one it could never replace. Its veteran carrier corps, the Japanese Navy, would never again hold the initiative in the Pacific. The balance of power had shifted forever. Aftermath. The hidden weapon, the victory at Midway, was more than a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of information. The intelligence provided by Station HYPO had turned the tide of war. Yet outside the small circle of men who knew the truth, few would ever understand what had happened. To the world, the victory seemed miraculous. To those in the basement at Pearl Harbor, it was the logical result of mathematics, logic, and relentless persistence. Rochefort and his team, exhausted but exhilarated, continued their work even as the battle reports came in. They knew their war was far from over. The Japanese would change their additives again, alter their codebooks, and adapt, but so would they. HYPO would continue breaking JN-25, and with each iteration, America's advantage grew. When Nimitz later reviewed the intelligence that had guided his decisions, he called it the most accurate piece of tactical intelligence in naval history. He was right. The prediction of the Japanese approach off by only 5 minutes, 5 miles, and 5 degrees remains one of the greatest feats of signals intelligence ever achieved. The men of Station HYPO had won a victory without firing a single shot. Their weapon had been knowledge, and it had proven mightier than any gun or bomb. The victory that changed everything. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. After 4 days of fierce fighting across the vast emptiness of the Pacific, when the guns fell silent, the ocean burned with the wreckage of Japan's once invincible carrier fleet. The waves rolled over the shattered hulls of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 proud ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. In exchange, the United States had lost 1 carrier, USS Yorktown, and a single destroyer, USS Hamona. Small price for what had been achieved. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Japan's expansion across the Pacific stopped dead. Its naval aviation arm, the finest in the world at the start of 1942, was crippled beyond repair, and for the first time in the war, the United States seized the initiative. Yet the full story of why Midway had been possible, the story of Station HYPO's invisible victory, remained hidden. Even within the Navy, only a handful of officers knew that the triumph had been built, not just on courage and gunnery, but on the painstaking work of mathematicians, linguists, and radio operators buried deep underground. As news of the victory spread across America, the public rejoiced. Newspapers called it the miracle at Midway. But to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the miracle had not been divine. It had been analytical. The intelligence edge, the code room at Pearl Harbor, did not rest after Midway. Far from it. The men of Station HYPO, or Rochefort, Dyer, Finnegan, Laswell, and their team knew the Japanese would regroup and strike again. The JN-25 code remained in use, though with new additives and periodic adjustments. The challenge was to keep pace. Each day brought new intercepts. Thousands of groups of numbers streaming in from listening stations across the Pacific, Hawaii, Corregidor, Australia, and even tiny islands with hastily constructed radio shacks. Operators typed ceaselessly, transcribing strings of digits from Japanese naval communications, which were then sent to Pearl Harbor for analysis. Rochefort's team continued to work in the same windowless basement that had produced the Midway breakthrough. The air was still thick with cigarette smoke and the relentless clatter of IBM punch-card machines. New recruits arrived, linguists trained in Japanese, mathematicians fresh out of college, and even a few women from the Navy clerical service who proved to be astonishingly good at pattern recognition. Though exhausted, the team pressed on. They understood something fundamental. Intelligence was perishable. What they learned today might save lives tomorrow, but only if it reached commanders in time. Their work began to yield results almost immediately. From June through August 1942, HYPO's decrypts revealed Japanese plans to reinforce the Solomon Islands and construct an airfield on a remote island called Guadalcanal. Acting on this intelligence, Nimitz ordered the first major American counteroffensive of the Pacific War. On August 7, 1942, US Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, seizing the unfinished airstrip and renaming it Henderson Field. It was the beginning of a grueling, 6-month battle, but one that would not have been possible without the insight that came from Station HYPO's ceaseless vigilance. A fragile secret evens as HYPO's success grew. Danger of another kind loomed this time, not from Japan, but from Washington. In the aftermath of Midway, Admiral Nimitz recommended Joseph Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal, praising his team's contribution as decisive to the victory. But the recommendation encountered resistance from a powerful quarter, the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, led by Captain John Redman and his brother, Commander Joseph Redman. The Redmans resented Rochefort deeply. They believed all intelligence should flow through Washington, not from field stations like HYPO. To them, Rochefort's direct communication with Nimitz, bypassing the chain of command, was worse. It made them look irrelevant. The rivalry between Pearl Harbor and Washington had existed for years, but after Midway, it became a quiet war of its own. The Redmans argued that Washington's code-breaking unit, OP-20, had provided the key intelligence for the battle, not HYPO. They accused Rochefort of claiming credit for work he didn't do. In reality, OP-20G's contribution had been minimal. It was HYPO that had decrypted the decisive messages and uncovered the Japanese plan. But in the opaque world of military intelligence, politics often outweighed truth. Rochefort, for his part, paid little attention to bureaucratic maneuvering. He cared only for the work. When Nimitz urged him to defend himself in Washington, Rochefort refused. "If they don't know what we did," he said, "no amount of talking will convince them." That refusal would cost him dearly. The near exposure. Barely a month after the Battle of Midway, Station HYPO's greatest secret nearly came undone, not through espionage, but through journalism. On June 7, 1942, the same day the Japanese carrier slipped beneath the waves, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story by reporter Stanley Johnston titled "Navy Had Word of Japan's Plan to Strike at Sea." The article was shockingly accurate. It described how the U.S. Navy had known in advance that Japan intended to attack Midway and even hinted that the Americans had intercepted Japanese communications. Though Johnston did not explicitly mention codebreaking, the implication was dangerously clear. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox were furious. They demanded Johnston's prosecution under the Espionage Act. A grand jury convened in Chicago, and the Navy sent investigators scrambling to trace the leak. Fortunately, the Japanese either never saw the article or dismissed it as speculation. If they had recognized the truth that their most secret naval code had been penetrated, they would have changed it immediately, blinding Allied intelligence for months. Luck, more than anything, saved the secret that day. Rochefort and his team read about the Tribune article in silence. They understood how close disaster had come. For years, they had guarded the secret of JN-25 with monastic devotion, knowing that one careless word could destroy everything they had built. Now the breach had come not from spies, but from their own country's press. The quiet front expands despite the bureaucratic infighting and the near exposure. HYPO's mission grew. The Pacific Warfront was vast, stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, and the need for PAP intelligence was constant. By late 1942, the Navy had established a network of cooperating stations. Station Cast in Australia, relocated from the Philippines after its fall. Fromell in Melbourne, a joint US-Australian unit, and HYPO at Pearl Harbor, which remained the central hub for Pacific cryptanalysis. Together, they processed thousands of intercepts daily. The IBM punchcard machines multiplied, lined up in rows like metal soldiers. Operators worked in 3 shifts to keep them running 24 hours a day. The machines whirred, sorted, and clattered, processing data faster than any human could manage. Analysts cross-referenced code groups, charted message frequency, and built massive card indexes, cataloging every known code group and its possible meaning. Gradually, the team began identifying patterns of movement in the Japanese Navy. Even when messages were only partially readable, the traffic analysis told its own story: where ships were concentrated, which bases were active, which regions were going silent. The war in the Pacific was now fought as much in numbers and frequencies as 10 torpedoes and bombs. Operation Vengeance. In the spring of 1943, Station HYPO achieved one of its most dramatic intelligence successes, an operation so precise it bordered on assassination. On April 14, 1943, Rochefort's analysts intercepted a Japanese message that at first seemed routine. A travel schedule for a high-ranking officer flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18, but the name attached to the itinerary was electrifying: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The message contained Yamamoto's exact flight route, time, and escort strength. It was the kind of intelligence gift that came once in a generation. The decrypt was sent to Admiral Nimitz, who immediately recognized its value. He forwarded it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where the decision was made: Yamamoto must not survive the war. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal took off on one of the longest fighter missions of the war. Flying 500 miles over open ocean, they arrived at the exact spot and time indicated in the decrypted message. As Yamamoto's transport plane approached, the Americans swooped in. Both of Yamamoto's aircraft were shot down over the jungles of Buk. The admiral's body was later found, still seated in his chair, sword at his side. The mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance, was a complete success, and it demonstrated the devastating precision of Allied signals intelligence. For the first time, a military commander had been deliberately targeted and killed using decrypted communications. To the men of HYPO, it was proof that information could kill as effectively as any bomb. The fall of Rochefort. Yet, even as HYPO's successes mounted, Washington's resentment deepened. The Redmond brothers in the Office of Naval Intelligence continued their campaign against Rochefort, portraying him as erratic, insubordinate, and unfit for command. They insisted that the intelligence breakthroughs at Midway and afterward were due to their own department's efforts. Through bureaucratic maneuvering, they finally convinced Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, to act. In October 1942, without warning, Rochefort was relieved of command of Station HYPO and reassigned to supervise the construction of floating dry docks on the west coast and administrative exile far from the war's front lines. The man who had made possible one of the most decisive victories in naval history was dismissed quietly, without medal, ceremony, or even acknowledgement. His colleagues were devastated. Leighton later wrote, "The treatment of Joe Rochefort was one of the great injustices of the war. Even Nimitz, bound by the chain of command, was powerless to intervene. He continued to send personal letters to Rochefort, thanking him for his work and expressing hope that one day the truth would be known. Rochefort never complained publicly. He simply disappeared from view, continuing his naval career in silence. For him, the war had been won in the basement of HYPO, and that was enough." Safford and the Seeds of Legacy. While Rochefort's career ended in bureaucratic exile, the man who had started it all, Captain Lawrence Safford, the father of Navy cryptology, fared little better. By early 1942, Safford had also been sidelined from his post in Washington, the victim of the same internal rivalries that plagued the Navy's intelligence community. His insistence on autonomy for cryptologic operations and his criticism of higher command made him unpopular with powerful officers. Like Rochefort, he was quietly reassigned to a desk job and spent the rest of the war in relative obscurity. But both men left behind something more enduring than titles or medals: a system. Under their vision, naval cryptology had evolved from a handful of officers working with pencils and paper into a coordinated global network, one that would shape not just the Pacific War, but the intelligence architecture of the modern world. The human cost of secrecy. The men and women of HYPO paid a heavy price for their success. They worked in secrecy so deep that even their families did not know what they did. Letters home spoke vaguely of desk work or communications duties. No one outside the cryptologic world could be told that they were reading the enemy's mail. The strain was immense. Many worked 18-hour days, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline. They lived in a twilight world of constant pressure and total anonymity. When they succeeded, others received the glory. When they failed, no one outside their own walls even knew. After the war, most of them would never speak of their service. Their accomplishments remained classified for decades. Only in the 1970s and 1980s, when the National Security Agency began declassifying World War II cryptologic records with the story of Station HYPO and JN-25 come to light. Intelligence becomes strategy. Even without Rochefort, the system he built continued to thrive. The Navy's Signals Intelligence Units, now unified under the codename Ultra, provided critical insights for every major operation of the Pacific War. When Japanese convoys sailed, American submarines were already waiting along their routes. When enemy air units redeployed, Allied bombers knew where to strike. When Japan attempted to reinforce isolated garrisons, their ships often sailed straight into ambushes. The codebreakers had transformed from passive observers into active participants in strategy. They no longer merely provided data, they shaped decisions. By 1944, the scale of their achievement was staggering. Allied cryptanalysts could read nearly 80% of Japanese naval traffic within days of transmission. The intelligence picture was so complete that American commanders sometimes joked that Yamamoto himself was writing our battle plans. It wasn't far from the truth. The turning tide as 1943 gave way to 1944. The Pacific War turned decisively in America's favor. From the Solomon Islands to the Gilberts, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, each step forward was guided by intelligence born in places like HYPO. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Ultra-intelligence gave Admiral Raymond Spruance exact information on Japanese carrier movements. The resulting air battle, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, annihilated Japan's remaining naval aviation. From that point onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. The men who had begun their war at Pearl Harbor now fought from a position of desperation, and behind every victory from Guadalcanal to the Philippines stood the unseen legacy of Station HYPO. A handful of analysts who had proved that knowledge, when wielded with discipline and courage, could change the course of history. That quiet end of Warby, the summer of 1945. The Pacific War that had begun with fire at Pearl Harbor ended in an inferno over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's cities lay in ruins, its navy at the bottom of the sea, its once proud empire reduced to surrender. But the victory was not only one of bombs and bullets, it was also a triumph of information, born from years of invisible labor by the men and women who had learned to read the enemy's mind. In the dim basements and hidden offices of the Pacific, analysts and linguists, people whose names would not appear in newspapers, had given the United States a weapon that no nation had ever possessed before: the ability to see the enemy's future before it happened. And yet, When the war ended, those who had waged that secret war simply disappeared back into obscurity. The code room at Pearl Harbor Station HYPO was sealed. Its files were locked away, its machines dismantled. The great IBM punch card sorters, once the heartbeat of the operation, were shipped to warehouses. The people who had worked there returned to civilian life or were reassigned to other duties. They were forbidden to speak of what they had done. For the next 30 years, the story of HYPO would remain buried beneath classification markings, stamped top secret ultra. Rochefort's silencing. Joseph John Rochefort, now a captain, completed his wartime service on the West Coast. He never again worked in cryptology. The Navy had reassigned him to oversee the construction of floating dry docks, a job that required logistical skill but offered none of the intellectual challenge that had once consumed his life. He accepted it without complaint. He had always believed that the mission mattered more than the medals, but those who knew him could see that something had broken inside him after his removal from HYPO. He had built one of the most effective intelligence organizations in history, yet bureaucratic jealousy had destroyed his career. After retiring from the Navy in 1946, Rochefort settled in Torrance, California, a modest suburb of Los Angeles. He lived quietly, rarely speaking of his wartime work. When asked about the Battle of Midway, he would simply smile and say, "That was a good day for the Navy." His contribution remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of senior officers. Even Admiral Nimitz, though deeply appreciative, could not publicly acknowledge him. The very existence of code-breaking operations like HYP or Ultra was among the most closely held secrets of the U.S. government. Decades would pass before Rochefort's name reappeared in history. Layton's loyalty. Edwin T. Layton, Rochefort's colleague and the man who had delivered the fateful intelligence briefing to Admiral Nimitz on May 27, 1942, continued to serve as Nimitz's intelligence officer throughout the war. Layton's ability to translate complex signals data into clear operational insights made him indispensable. He attended nearly every major strategy conference of the Pacific Campaign from the Solomons to the Philippines. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Nimitz trusted him completely. After the war, Layton retired as a rear admiral and, like Rochefort, kept silent for decades. He could not speak publicly of his role in breaking Japan's codes until the 1970s, when the National Security Agency (NSA) began declassifying wartime signals intelligence. When he finally published his memoir in 1985 titled "And I Was There, Pearl Harbor and Midway, Breaking the Secrets," the world learned for the first time how closely the fate of the Pacific War had turned on the work of Rochefort's team. In its pages, Layton wrote with quiet reverence about his friend, the treatment of Joe. Rochefort was one of the great injustices of the war. His mind was the sharpest blade we had, and it cut through the fog of war when we needed it most. Safford, the forgotten father while Rochefort had been the battlefield commander of cryptology. The architect of its foundation was Lawrence F. Safford, the man who had built the Navy's first code-breaking unit back in 1924. Safford never received recognition during his lifetime for his role in shaping America's cryptologic capabilities. By 1942, he had already been removed from his position in Washington, pushed out by the same political rivalries that had exiled Rochefort. For the remainder of the war, he worked quietly on routine assignments, a ghost among the bureaucracy he had helped create. He retired from the Navy in 1953 as a captain, largely forgotten by the public. When he died in 1973, only a few of his colleagues attended his funeral, but his work lived on in every cryptologic operation that followed. From the Cold War's electronic surveillance programs to the digital intelligence networks of the modern age. In 1999, the National Security Agency formally inducted him into its Cryptologic Hall of Honor, calling him the father of US Navy cryptology. It was an acknowledgement more than 70 years overdue. The hidden army of codebreakers. While Roche, Layton, and Safford were the visible few, hundreds of others had fought in the cryptologic shadows. The enlisted men of Station HYP, author radio operators, typists, mathematicians, and translators rarely received so much as a commendation. Many had entered the Navy as musicians or clerks. Few had ever expected to change the course of world history. Yet their hands had typed the intercepts, their eyes had recognized the patterns, and their discipline had kept the secrets safe. Many of them carried the strain for years. After the war, the stress of prolonged secrecy weighed heavily. They had seen what others had not. They had known of Japanese plans weeks before battles, and had watched those predictions come true in fire and blood, yet they could never speak of it. One former HYPO operator later described the experience. It was like shouting into the wind and having no one hear you. We won our war in silence. The declassification of secrets in the 1970s, a new generation of historians and intelligence officials began to revisit the Pacific War through newly declassified materials. Among them were the cryptologic archives of the U.S. Navy, long sealed under layers of classification. What emerged astonished scholars. The story of how Station HYPO had broken JN-25 and enabled the victory at Midway rewrote much of what historians thought they knew about the war. The victory had not been mere luck, nor a desperate gamble by Nimitz. It had been the product of information mastery. Journalists and authors began seeking out the surviving veterans of HYPO. Some were old men by then, living quietly in retirement. A few refused to talk, bound by decades of secrecy. Others, like Edwin Layton, finally broke their silence. The truth spread slowly, but it spread. By the 1980s, the names of Rochefort, Layton, and Safford were once again spoken with the reverence they deserved. Documentaries, scholarly articles, and books revealed the invisible war of intelligence that had raged beneath the waves and behind the headlines. And then, at last, came the moment of justice. Recognition long delayed. In 1985, nearly 40 years after the war, retired naval officers began a campaign to posthumously honor Captain Joseph Rochefort. Admiral Nimitz, who had died in 1966, had long argued that Rochefort's contributions at Midway merited the Distinguished Service Medal. His successors now took up that cause. After months of review, the Navy agreed. On May 30, 1986, in a ceremony at the White House, President Ronald Reagan presented the Distinguished Service Medal to Rochefort's surviving family. His children stood in his place, accepting the honor from Vice President George H.W. Bush and Vice Admiral William St., then Director of the NSA. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary service as officer in charge of the Combat Intelligence Unit, U.S. Pacific Fleet, during the Battle of Midway, his brilliant and untiring efforts were largely responsible for the victory which turned the tide of war in the Pacific." It was, at last, official recognition for the man whose intellect had outwitted the Imperial Japanese Navy. Rochefort had been dead 10 years, but his legacy finally had a name. The school that bears his name today, the U.S. Navy's Information Warfare Training Command at Dam Neck, Virginia. The school where future intelligence and cryptologic officers are trained bears the name the Captain Joseph J. Rochefort Building. New officers who walk its halls learn not only the technical aspects of code breaking and information warfare but also the story of the man who embodied its spirit. A plaque at the entrance reads, "He fought a war without guns, in silence, and gave his commander the power to see the enemy's plans before they were executed." Rochefort's story, once buried under secrecy and politics, is now part of the Navy's proudest tradition. The legacy of Station HYPO. The lessons of Station HYPO went far beyond the war. They reshaped how nations conceived of intelligence itself. From the rubble of World War II, a new institution arose, the National Security Agency, NSA, founded in 1952 to centralize and modernize the United States cryptologic operations. Many of its early architects were veterans of HYPO and its sister stations. They carried with them the principles Rochefort had lived by: collaboration across distance. HYPO Cast and Frommel had shown that intelligence could be produced through global teamwork long before the Internet made it easy. The fusion of human and machine intelligence. The IBM punchcard systems that clattered in HYPO's basement were the ancestors of the digital computers that would soon transform signals analysis. Cultural understanding as a weapon. The emphasis on linguists and cultural specialists, people like Alva Laswell and Layton, proved that knowing the enemy's mind could be as decisive as knowing his fleet movements. Direct access to commanders. Rochefort's insistence on communicating intelligence directly to operational leaders rather than through bureaucratic intermediaries became a model for modern intelligence organizations. These principles guided not only the NSA but also intelligence structures across the Western world. From Britain's GCHQ to NATO's signals units, the broader legacy of Intelligensta, story of Midway and Station HYPO, remains one of the clearest demonstrations in history that information can decide battles. It transformed intelligence from a supporting role into a strategic weapon. The codebreakers of World War II, American, British, and Allied, proved that wars could be won, not only by strength of arms, but by the mastery of knowledge. The concept of information superiority, so central to modern military doctrine, was born in those cramped rooms filled with paper, pencils, and the hum of primitive machines. From the Cold War's electronic eavesdropping to today's cyber intelligence networks, the DNA of Station HYPO lives on. Every satellite intercept, every encrypted data analysis, every algorithm designed to detect hidden signals in the noise carries a trace of what those men discovered in 1942. That patterns hide truth, and truth wins wars. The moral dimension. Yet there was another legacy to moral one. The men of HYPO demonstrated the power of intellect harnessed to duty, of science placed in service to survival. But their story also serves as a warning. Knowledge is power, and power demands integrity. Rochefort had refused to compromise truth for politics, even when it cost him his career. Safford had sacrificed his reputation to defend the independence of cryptology from bureaucratic interference. Leighton had chosen loyalty over ambition, standing by his commander and his comrades even when silence meant anonymity. Their example reminds every generation that intelligence, like any weapon, can serve either arrogance or understanding. In their hands, it served freedom. The circle closes on July 20, 1976. Joseph Rochefort died quietly in Torrance, California, at the age of 7. There was no military funeral, no formal recognition. His passing merited only a brief obituary in the Los Angeles Times. Few who read it knew that the man being buried had once altered the course of world history. It would take another decade before the Navy corrected its oversight and honored him publicly. But by then, it no longer mattered to Rochefort. He had always believed that what counted was not recognition but results. He once told a colleague, "We weren't heroes, we just did the job the way it had to be done." That humility defined him and the countless others who worked beside him. In the Secret War of Information, Epilogue, The Power of No. May 27, 1942. In a small office at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz had learned that America could read every Japanese secret. 1 week later, that knowledge had changed the course of the Pacific War. It is easy, in hindsight, to see Midway as inevitably a clash of carriers, of bombs, and bravery. But at its core, it was a triumph of minds over machines. The Americans who fought that battle won because they knew, and they knew because, 2 decades earlier, a handful of officers had believed that understanding would someday matter more than gunfire. The war that began in fire ended in silence. And in that silence, the men of Station HYP left behind a legacy that endures to this day. Every analyst who sifts through intercepted data, every linguist who translates enemy communications, every engineer who builds machines to find meaning in chaos walks in the shadow of those who once listened to the hum of the Pacific and heard, in the numbers, the sound of victory. Final reflection. The story of Station HYPO is not merely a tale of code-breaking. It is a meditation on the power of human intellect and moral courage. It reminds us that in every era, there will be those who fight in silence, armed not with weapons, but with patience, insight, and the unshakable conviction that truth, however small, can save nations. From the dusty offices of the 1920s to the digital command centers of the 21st century, their lineage continues. Their methods have evolved, their machines transformed, but their mission remains the same: to understand before it happens, and to act upon that understanding with wisdom and resolve. Because in the end, as the story of Midway shows, the greatest weapon of all is not the aircraft carrier or the bomb. It is the ability to know,